I used to work night shifts at a psychiatric hospital, until the night I heard the screams that didn't belong to any patient or any living thing at all. Tonight, Dreadscribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The first night I reported for duty at the old mental asylum, the building greeted me like a living thing. Its corridors seemed to breathe, exhaling drafts of cold, damp air that carried the metallic tang of rust and disinfectant. The walls were stained with watermarks that looked almost like veins, and the floors groaned beneath my boots, as though I were walking across the ribs of some massive, slumbering creature. I told myself it was just age and neglect. The asylum had been standing for nearly a century, but deep down, I felt like I had stepped inside something that was aware of me. My shift was quiet for the first few hours, the kind of eerie calm that presses on your ears until even the hum of a fluorescent light sounds deafening. The patients murmured or slept fitfully in their locked rooms, and I busied myself with rounds, checking doors, signing charts. At 3:17 a.m., the quiet shattered. A scream ripped through the halls, raw and primal, so sharp it felt like it split the air itself. I froze, my clipboard tumbling from my hands, my heart pounding like a drum inside my chest. Screams were nothing new in this place. Trauma often found its voice in the dark. But this one was different. It was too layered, too alien, a chorus of agony twisted into a single inhuman note. I raced down the corridor, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. As I checked each room, I found the patients still restrained or sedated, some even snoring peacefully. No one had moved. The scream came again, this time deeper, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my boots. It seemed to come from the very bones of the building, resonating like the groan of a sinking ship. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but she only gave me a sharp look and muttered, "Old pipes. You'll get used to it." Her tone had the brittle edge of someone who was lying to herself as much as to me. When I pressed, she shut me down with a warning, "Stay out of the West Wing." The West Wing had always been a mystery. Its doors were chained shut, a heavy padlock glinting in the dim light, and the glass panels were painted black. Staff members avoided even glancing in its direction, like superstitious villagers skirting a haunted house. I'd overheard rumors in the break room, whispers of a fire, of patients who had vanished without explanation. But no one would speak openly about it. That night, as the screams grew louder, something inside me snapped. Fear mixed with a reckless need to understand. I found myself standing before the chained doors, the padlock icy under my trembling hands. With every scream, the temperature dropped, frost creeping along the walls like a spreading infection. My breath fogged in the air as I pried the lock open with a stolen key I wasn't supposed to have. The door groaned open, releasing a blast of air so cold it burned my lungs. The darkness beyond was absolute, swallowing the beam of my flashlight. I took one step inside, my heartbeat thunderous in my ears, and realized with a gut-deep certainty that the screams weren't coming from any patient. They were coming from something far worse, something waiting just beyond the reach of the light. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, but the key was gone, ripped from my pocket, or maybe it had never truly been there at all. The hallway ahead stretched into a suffocating void, lined with peeling wallpaper that curled like burnt paper. My flashlight flickered as though something were draining its power, each pulse of light revealing brief, jagged glimpses of rusted wheelchairs and overturned gurneys. The air smelled of mildew and old smoke, sharp and bitter, like a memory of a fire that had never gone out. I moved slowly, my breaths shallow and ragged. The screams had gone silent, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. It was almost like a chant, but broken, incomplete, a song missing its final note. My boots crunched over shattered glass, and each sound felt magnified, a beacon in the dark. I kept telling myself that this was just an abandoned wing, nothing more. But the deeper I went, the colder it became, until I could see my breath in thick clouds, swirling like ghosts in the narrow beam of my light. A shape loomed at the end of the hall, a massive iron door, bolted and scarred with deep gouges as if something had tried to claw its way out. My pulse quickened. I should have turned back, but some part of me was pulled forward like a moth to a flame. When I reached out, the metal was so cold it burned my fingertips. As I leaned closer, a faint whisper leaked through the cracks, threading its way into my ears. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but the cadence made my stomach twist with instinctive fear. I pushed the door open and an icy wind roared past me, extinguishing my flashlight completely. For a heartbeat, I was swallowed by absolute darkness. Then slowly my eyes adjusted. The room beyond wasn't a ward at all. It was a cavernous chamber, far larger than the building should have allowed. The walls were slick with condensation, glistening like wet skin, and strange symbols were etched into every surface, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. In the center of the room stood an old, rusted contraption that looked part medical device, part torture instrument. Wires and tubes extended from it like veins, disappearing into the walls. As I drew closer, the humming grew louder, rising to a fever pitch. That's when I saw them. Outlines of human forms suspended in the mist, their mouths open in eternal silent screams. Their bodies flickered like images on a broken television, there and not there all at once. My mind rebelled against what I was seeing. These weren't patients. They weren't even entirely human anymore. The sound that had haunted the halls wasn't their cries, but the echo of whatever force had twisted them into this state, a force that was still here. The humming cut off abruptly, plunging the chamber into an awful silence. In that breathless void, a single, perfect scream erupted behind me. So close it felt like it came from inside my own skull. I turned, but there was nothing there, nothing, except a shadow that stretched toward me, impossibly long, as though the darkness itself had decided to take shape. The morning after the screams, my supervisor found me pale and trembling in the break room. I told her what I'd heard, what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, in the sealed corridor. Her expression darkened like a storm rolling in. She leaned close, her voice low and clipped, and told me in no uncertain terms to stay out of the West Wing. It had been abandoned for decades after a catastrophic fire, she said. No one went there. No one should go there. The way she said it made my skin crawl, like the words themselves carried weight. But there was a flicker in her eyes, a fleeting fear that she couldn't hide. She wasn't just warning me. She was pleading, for hours. I tried to bury myself in routine, checking on sedated patients, refilling supply carts, pretending that my mind wasn't replaying that inhuman scream over and over like a broken record. But by nightfall, the sound returned. It began faintly, a low vibration underfoot, before swelling into a bone-chilling wail that shook the very walls. The patients thrashed in their beds, some covering their ears, others muttering prayers. Whatever this was, it wasn't in their minds. It was real, almost against my will. My feet carried me toward the forbidden wing. The double doors loomed at the end of the hall, their metal surface warped by heat from some long-ago inferno. Rust streaked the hinges like dried blood. The padlock that had sealed it shut was gone, though no one had removed it. It was as if the building itself had decided to unlock this place. My breath fogged in the air as I stepped closer, the temperature dropping so quickly it felt like I had walked into a freezer. When I pushed the doors open, a gust of frigid wind slammed into me, carrying the acrid tang of ash and something older, something sour and metallic. The West Wing stretched out before me like a mausoleum for forgotten lives. Beds lay overturned, their frames twisted and blackened. Walls peeled in ragged sheets, exposing burned plaster beneath. In the dim light, the smoke-stained ceiling seemed to sag like the skin of a corpse. I moved forward cautiously, each step stirring up clouds of ancient soot that clung to my clothes and hair. In the center of the largest ward, I found something that made my pulse stutter. Amid the debris stood a machine unlike anything I had ever seen. It was massive and archaic, with knobs and levers covered in a film of grime. Thick blackened wires snaked from its base into the walls, vanishing into darkness like veins disappearing into flesh. It didn't belong in a hospital. It didn't belong anywhere. As I knelt to examine it, the overhead lights began to flicker wildly, plunging the room into a strobe of shadow and glare. That's when I heard it. Not the scream this time, but whispering. Faint at first, then growing clearer, as if a dozen mouths were pressed right against my ear. The voices weren't speaking any language I knew, but I understood the emotion. Hunger. The doors behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash. My flashlight sputtered out, leaving only darkness and those terrible rising whispers. And then I realized they weren't echoes of the past at all. They were aware of me, and they wanted me to stay. The whispers pressed against my skull like icy fingers, threading through my thoughts, pulling at memories I hadn't touched in years. My breath came in ragged bursts as I spun in the pitch black, searching for any trace of light. The room felt alive now, its walls expanding and contracting in rhythm with the murmurs. When my flashlight finally flickered back to life, its beam caught something that hadn't been there before. Shapes shifting along the far wall, elongated shadows writhing like worms under the surface. I stumbled backward, my boot striking a rusted bed frame. The metallic clang rang out like a gunshot, and the whispers immediately stopped. In that sudden, suffocating silence, I became aware of my own heartbeat, loud and frantic. It was then I heard a new sound, slow, deliberate breathing that wasn't mine. It came from behind the strange machine, deep and guttural, like air being dragged through a broken reed. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I edged closer. The machine hummed faintly now, a low vibration that traveled through the floor and into my bones. Its wires pulsed as though carrying some dark current, the glow beneath their burned sheathing eerily organic. I realized with a jolt of nausea that the wires didn't just lead into the walls. They were the walls, stretching deep into the foundation, feeding the entire building like a parasitic root system. I reached out to touch one of the knobs, and the moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, a vision exploded behind my eyes. I saw the West Wing as it had been decades ago, patients strapped to beds, doctors hovering like vultures, and this same machine roaring to life as people screamed, not from pain, but from their very essence being stripped away. The vision snapped off, leaving me gasping, my throat raw as if I had been screaming too. The whispers surged back, louder now, their hunger palpable. They weren't just disembodied voices. They were fragments of the people this machine had consumed, trapped in a limbo between life and death. I staggered back, my flashlight swinging wildly, and that's when I saw them. Outlines of figures forming in the thick, ash-choked air, their faces warped in expressions of endless torment. Their mouths opened and closed soundlessly, but the whispers poured from them, weaving together into a single terrible chorus. Panicked, I bolted for the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The rusted metal was ice cold, freezing my palms to its surface until I ripped them away, leaving skin behind. The whispers rose to a shriek, and the room itself seemed to tilt, throwing me to my knees. In the strobing light, I saw one of the shadowy figures lunge forward, its elongated limbs moving with an unnatural, insect-like precision. My flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness. The last thing I felt was a dozen cold hands brushing against my skin, guiding me not toward escape, but deeper into the room's black heart. And in that perfect dark, a single clear thought cut through the madness. The screams had never left this place. They had only been waiting for someone new to join them. I didn't sleep after what happened in the West Wing, even after I escaped that room of whispers and shadows. Their voices clung to me like smoke in my lungs. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flickers of their faces, their mouths opening and closing in silent despair. By morning, I wasn't just frightened, I was starving for answers. Fear had curdled into obsession, and obsession has a way of making you reckless. I needed to know what this asylum was hiding, and I knew exactly where to look. The records room sat at the far end of the East Corridor, a place I'd passed countless times but never entered. It was locked naturally, but after last night, locked doors meant nothing to me. My trembling hands found the spare key tucked beneath the desk in the nurse's station, a discovery that felt too convenient, as though someone had left it for me. I slipped it into my pocket and crept down the silent hall, my footsteps muffled by decades of dust. When I turned the key, the door groaned open like the throat of some ancient creature. A wave of musty air hit me, thick with the smell of mildew and paper rot. The room was a graveyard of information, towering shelves packed with files, cabinets stuffed with folders so brittle they seemed ready to disintegrate at a touch. My flashlight cast a narrow beam, illuminating clouds of dust that swirled like spirits disturbed from their rest. I began tearing through the records, the names and dates blurring together as I flipped through them. Most were mundane: medical charts, psychiatric evaluations, discharge forms. But then I found a cabinet tucked into the deepest shadow, marked only with a faded, stenciled word: restricted. My pulse quickened as I yanked it open. Inside were fewer files, but they were thicker. Their covers stamped with a seal I didn't recognize, a circle split by jagged lines, like a cracked mirror. The top file bore a title that sent a chill racing through me: Project Echo. My hands shook as I opened it, scanning the typewritten pages. At first, the language was clinical, almost boring. Discussions of neural oscillations, cortical mapping, and memory suppression techniques. But as I read further, the tone shifted. The project's aim was nothing short of terrifying: to manipulate brainwaves in order to erase traumatic memories, essentially rewriting a person's mind. But something had gone wrong. The process, when pushed too far, didn't just delete memories. It ripped holes in consciousness itself, tearing open passages to elsewhere. The reports became increasingly erratic, filled with frantic notes and crossed-out sentences. One chilling line stood out amid the chaos: subjects may exhibit vocal anomalies. Screaming may not originate from this dimension. My stomach turned to ice. Suddenly, the inhuman screams I'd heard in the halls had context, a context more horrifying than anything I'd imagined. These weren't just echoes of suffering. They were signals, bleeding through from whatever place the experiments had touched. Before I could absorb the full weight of this revelation, a sound split the air. It was that same unearthly scream, closer than ever before, so loud the papers on the desk shuddered. The lights above me flickered violently, plunging the room into flashes of shadow. And then I realized something terrible. The scream wasn't coming from down the hall this time. It was inside the room with me. The sound was so sharp it felt like it was carving through the marrow of my bones. I staggered back, clutching my ears, but there was no escape. The scream wasn't just a noise. It was inside me, reverberating through my skull like a tuning fork struck by a god's hand. The records room seemed to warp around me, the shelves bending like heat ripples, files swaying as if caught in an unseen current. When the scream finally cut off, it left behind a silence so heavy it felt alive, like something was holding its breath. My flashlight flickered wildly, painting the walls in frantic, jerking strokes of light. That's when I saw a movement, not a person, but a ripple, as though the very air were peeling open. A thin, vertical line appeared in the corner of the room, glowing faintly with a sickly green hue. It reminded me of a surgical incision, precise yet wrong, and through it seeped a cold so bitter it seemed to burn. The papers on the desk lifted slightly, drawn toward that impossible seam. The Project Echo file lay open at my feet, and my eyes fell on a handwritten note scrawled in the margins. It was barely legible, but one line jumped out at me: "Do not answer the voices. They are not speaking to you. They are looking for you." My breath hitched as a whisper bloomed behind me, impossibly close, curling around my ear like a tendril of smoke. It wasn't words exactly, but something deeper, like meaning without language. A call felt in the marrow rather than heard. I spun around, my back hitting a cabinet so hard it rattled. The seam in the corner widened, a thin slit in reality itself. For a moment I saw shapes moving beyond it, elongated figures twisting like strands of DNA, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Their mouths opened in silent cries, and though no sound escaped them, the scream I'd heard echoed in my mind again, louder now, demanding to be acknowledged. Panic propelled me toward the door, but when I reached for the handle, it was gone. The wood beneath my hands smooth and seamless, as though the exit had never existed. The records room was no longer a room at all. It felt like a trap, a living organism closing around me. The shelves buckled inward, files spilling open, their pages filling the air like a storm of white feathers. Among the chaos, I caught glimpses of words: neural breach, consciousness rupture, auditory contagion. Each phrase drove a spike of dread deeper into my chest. Then, in a moment of terrible clarity, I understood. The screams weren't just signs of suffering, they were bridges. Project Echo hadn't merely torn holes between dimensions. It had created a pathway and the voices were trying to cross. Each scream was a hand reaching through, grasping for something solid. The seam split wide with a sound like tearing flesh. A wind roared out of it, pulling at my clothes, dragging me toward that impossible opening. Just before darkness swallowed me, I heard one final whisper, clear and chilling. The night after I discovered the truth about Project Echo, sleep was impossible. My mind replayed that final whisper again and again. Now we know where you are. Every creak of the old building sounded like approaching footsteps, every flicker of light like a shadow reaching for me. I tried to bury myself in routine, making my rounds in silence, but the air felt different, charged with something unseen. It was as though the asylum itself was awake and watching. Around midnight, as I passed the south corridor, a figure caught my eye. An elderly woman sat perfectly still in a wheelchair, her thin frame wrapped in a tattered blanket. I froze. I knew every patient on this ward, and I had never seen her before. Her hair was white and wispy, her face a network of fine lines, and her eyes, impossibly pale, almost translucent, seemed to look through me. She smiled, a small knowing curve of her lips, and whispered my name. My skin prickled. I hadn't introduced myself. I hadn't said a word. "You shouldn't wander these halls alone," she said, her voice rasping like dry leaves. The walls remember. At first, I assumed she was rambling, like so many patients did in the haze of medication and sleepless nights. But there was a strange gravity to her words, a precision that felt intentional. She claimed her name was Agnes and that she had been here for 50 years, longer than the asylum had even existed under its current name. I almost laughed at the impossibility of it, but her gaze silenced me. There was no madness in those eyes, only certainty. I wheeled her into an empty patient room to speak privately, my curiosity outweighing my fear. Agnes told me fragments of a story, her voice weaving through the shadows like thread through a needle. She spoke of the West Wing, of patients who were never discharged because they were never truly cured. "They didn't leave," she murmured, leaning close. "But they didn't stay the same either. The doctors didn't heal them, they transformed them." The word transformed hung heavy in the air, like smoke that wouldn't disperse. My mind flashed to the inhuman figures I'd glimpsed in the abandoned wing, the whispers that weren't echoes at all. My stomach knotted as her story began to stitch itself into the fragments of what I'd already seen. Agnes beckoned me to follow her. Though her body looked frail, she moved with surprising speed, leading me down hallways I had never noticed before. She stopped before a wall at the end of a narrow corridor and pressed her palm against a section of crumbling plaster. With a groan of ancient hinges, the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden stairwell spiraling into darkness. As we descended, the temperature dropped sharply. The air grew thick and oppressive, heavy with the smell of damp stone and something metallic beneath it. My breathing quickened as a strange sound began to rise from the depths. Whispers. At first I thought they belonged to Agnes, but then I heard my name among them, repeated again and again, a hissed chant woven into the darkness. I spun around, heart hammering, but Agnes was gone. The stairwell stretched endlessly above me, empty and silent, leaving me utterly alone with the voices that knew who I was. Panic clawed at my throat as the darkness closed in around me. My flashlight beam trembled, slicing through the gloom in jittery arcs that only seemed to make the shadows deeper. I called out for Agnes, my voice breaking, but the only response was the hiss of my name echoing from somewhere far below. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like a hand sliding across my skin, cold and intimate, leaving behind an invisible mark. The deeper I breathed, the heavier the air became, until each inhale felt like swallowing water. I forced myself to keep moving down the narrow steps, gripping the rusted handrail until it bit into my palm. The stone walls were damp, streaked with black mold, and strange marks were carved into them. Not letters, not symbols I recognized, but shapes that seemed to writhe if I looked too long. My rational mind screamed to turn back, to flee, but there was something magnetic about those whispers. They didn't just call my name. They knew me. They spoke to the deepest fears I'd never voiced, like someone had peeled open my thoughts and left them on display. The stairwell ended abruptly at a heavy iron door. My light revealed its surface was scarred with deep gouges, as though something inside had tried desperately to get out. My pulse thudded in my ears. Agnes's cryptic warning rang through my memory. The walls remember. I realized now she hadn't been speaking in metaphor. The asylum didn't just house memories. It held onto them, trapping fragments of people in its very foundation. I pushed the door open, and a wave of frigid air poured over me, thick with the scent of rot and antiseptic. The chamber beyond was vast, a cathedral built beneath the earth, its ceiling disappearing into blackness. Rusted gurneys and shattered restraints littered the floor, remnants of experiments too horrific to imagine. At the center of the room was a pit ringed with jagged stone. A faint green light seeped from its depths, pulsing in time with the whispers. I crept closer, compelled despite every instinct screaming at me to run. As I peered over the edge, my stomach lurched. The pit wasn't empty. Shapes moved within the green haze. Twisted, elongated forms that shifted in and out of focus, like they were caught between worlds. Their mouths opened and closed, releasing the chorus of whispers that now roared through the chamber. In the cacophony, I heard fragments of pleading, laughter, and rage all tangled together. And woven through it all was my name, repeated endlessly, like a hook sinking deeper into my mind. Then I saw her. Agnes stood on the opposite side of the pit, her pale eyes gleaming in the sickly light. Relief surged through me, but it curdled into horror as I realized she wasn't standing on anything. Her feet hovered inches above the stone, her body flickering like an unstable projection. She raised a trembling hand and pointed at me. "You've come too far," she whispered, her voice merging with the others. The ground beneath my feet trembled, cracks spiderwebbing outward from the pit. As the whispers reached a fever pitch, a single, guttural voice cut through them all, not calling my name this time, but speaking one terrible command: "Stay." The word "stay" echoed through my mind long after the chamber fell silent. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath, and when I turned to flee, the hidden stairwell seemed to have grown narrower, twisting like a corkscrew into the earth. I didn't remember climbing this many steps on the way down, but I forced myself upward, desperate to escape Agnes, the pit, and the terrible voice that had claimed me. Instead of leading back to safety, the stairwell spilled me into a vast tunnel network, dark and ancient, as though I'd stepped inside the skeleton of some buried beast. The air here was colder, heavier, almost liquid as it filled my lungs. My flashlight revealed walls carved from raw stone, their surfaces etched with strange symbols that spiraled and interlocked like a language I was never meant to understand. The grooves were so deep they seemed to pulse faintly, a dim glow bleeding from within. I reached out to trace one, but my fingertips burned the instant they made contact, leaving the scent of scorched skin. Whatever these markings were, they weren't decorative. They were warnings, or instructions. I moved cautiously, each footstep swallowed by the oppressive silence. The tunnels branched endlessly, a labyrinth of twisting passageways that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The deeper I ventured, the more wrong the geometry became. Some hallways sloped at impossible angles, others looped back on themselves, defying all sense of direction. It felt less like architecture and more like a living organism, growing and reshaping itself while I wandered through its veins. My light fell across a narrow archway, and beyond it lay a room frozen in time. Rusted gurneys stood in neat rows, their leather straps cracked and stiff with age. Cages hung from the ceiling like macabre lanterns, their bars bent outward as if something inside had forced its way free. Glass jars lined the shelves, their contents floating in murky fluid. I dared to lean closer to one and instantly wished I hadn't. Inside was something that resembled a human hand, only it had too many fingers, and each digit ended in a small, unblinking eye. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a laboratory, a place where science had been twisted beyond recognition. I thought of Project Echo, of the West Wing, and realized this was where those experiments had begun. These tunnels weren't beneath the asylum by accident. The asylum had been built on top of them, like a seal keeping something buried. That's when I heard it. Laughter. It wasn't joyful or sane. It was jagged and broken, a sound like a record played backward. The whispers I'd heard before joined in, threading around the laughter until they formed a terrible harmony. The voices didn't just echo in the tunnels. They vibrated inside my chest, syncing with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where my body ended and the sound began. Panic drove me forward. I ran blindly through the twisting corridors, my flashlight beam darting across walls slick with condensation. Just when my lungs were about to burst, I spotted a narrow stairwell leading upward. I scrambled up the steps 2 at a time, desperate for daylight. When I emerged at the top, I froze. I wasn't in the asylum's familiar halls anymore. I was standing inside a perfectly recreated version of my childhood bedroom. Every crack in the wallpaper, every faded toy exactly as I remembered. Except this wasn't my home. It was inside the asylum, and someone or something as I took a trembling step into the room. The air was warm here, too warm, and carried a faint, cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. My eyes darted across every familiar detail. The crooked bookshelf I'd tipped over when I was 6, the stuffed bear missing one ear, the cracked nightlight casting its weak glow against the wall. This wasn't a memory. It was a replica so precise it felt as though my childhood had been dissected and rebuilt, piece by piece inside these cursed walls. The whispering hadn't followed me up the stairs, but that didn't bring comfort. The silence here was worse. It was the kind of silence that listened, waiting for me to break it. I reached for the doorknob, praying this was some bizarre hallucination, but the metal was warm under my palm, pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. When I twisted it, the door didn't open. It dissolved into mist, curling away into nothingness, leaving me trapped. My pulse thundered. Whoever had built this room had done more than invade my memories. They had read them, stripped me bare the way Project Echo had stripped its subjects. I thought of the symbols carved into the tunnels and realized they weren't just warnings or commands. They were a map of the mind, a blueprint for reality itself. Someone had followed that map to me. I crossed the room cautiously, the floorboards creaking underfoot. As I passed the mirror above my dresser, I caught sight of my reflection and froze. It wasn't me staring back. The figure had my shape, my clothes, but its eyes were wrong, wide, hollow, and glowing faintly with that same sickly green light I'd seen in the pit. Slowly, its lips curved into a grin, a perfect echo of a childhood photo I hadn't seen in years. The laughter returned, distant at first, then closer, rising like a tide. It seemed to pour from the reflection, vibrating through the glass until hairline cracks splintered across its surface. My own voice whispered through the fissures, repeating my name over and over, each utterance tinged with hunger. I stumbled back, colliding with the bed. The quilt that had once comforted me now felt like a shroud. I had to escape. There had to be another way out. Dropping to my knees, I clawed beneath the bed frame, desperate for some hidden passage or hatch. My fingers brushed something cold and metallic. When I pulled it free, I realized it was a key, old iron and etched with the same symbols I'd seen carved into the tunnel walls. As soon as I touched it, the laughter cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating. The mirror rippled like disturbed water. My reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. It opened its mouth, and though no sound emerged, I understood the message clearly. Use the key or become the memory. Heart pounding, I jammed the key into the nearest wall. The entire room shuddered, wallpaper peeling away like wet skin. As the structure collapsed into swirling darkness, one thought seared through my mind. If this place could rebuild my past, what else was it capable of creating? The darkness swallowed me whole as the room I'd just destroyed with the key dissolved into nothingness. When the swirling void finally settled, I found myself standing in a corridor I didn't recognize. The air was damp and metallic, thick with the sharp tang of disinfectant and something older, sour, and wrong. The walls seemed to breathe faintly, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that wasn't my own. Ahead, a pale light flickered, revealing the outline of a ward that shouldn't have been there. My gut told me to turn back, but there was nowhere left to go. I stepped forward, and the floor shifted under my boots like soft clay. The ward stretched out before me in impossible directions, corridors bending in sharp, unnatural angles. The more I moved, the more the architecture seemed to warp. Hallways curved back on themselves, doors led to places I had already been, and the ceiling pulsed like an exposed vein. It was like walking through a nightmare someone else had designed, a maze built from fear itself. Rows of hospital beds lined either side of the hall. Each bed held a figure beneath a white sheet, perfectly still, as though caught between sleep and death. Their shapes were wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, limbs bent at angles that no human skeleton could match. I forced myself not to look directly at them, terrified that if I stared too long I'd see them move. The silence here wasn't empty. It was dense, as if sound itself had been smothered. My footsteps seemed to sink into the air and vanish. Then, faintly, I began to hear something. A whisper, low and broken, threading through the stillness. It wasn't coming from the figures. It was coming from inside my head. Memories surged up, jagged and uninvited. I saw flashes of my childhood, moments I knew were real, my mother's lullaby, the warm glow of a nightlight. But woven between those memories were scenes that didn't belong to me at all. A hallway filled with screaming patients, a doctor's gloved hand holding a syringe, the green glow of a machine humming in the dark. They flickered like broken film reels, merging until I couldn't tell which life was mine. My knees buckled, and I gripped the edge of a bed to steady myself. The sheet beneath my fingers was cold and damp, like flesh left too long in the rain. The realization struck me with bone-deep clarity. The asylum wasn't just breaking its patients. It was reshaping reality itself, rewriting memories and bending the world into something unrecognizable. These figures weren't victims or survivors. They were evidence of what happens when identity itself is tampered with. The whispering grew louder, pressing against my skull until it drowned out my thoughts. One of the sheets began to move. Slowly, impossibly, the figure beneath it sat up. My breath caught in my throat as the fabric slid away, revealing a face beneath. My face. It smiled at me, a twisted, perfect mirror of myself, and whispered my name. For a moment, my body forgot how to breathe. I stared into eyes that were unmistakably my own, yet older, hollower, filled with a knowledge I couldn't comprehend. My double tilted its head with a slow, deliberate motion, like a predator studying prey. The whispering around us grew deafening, layering into countless overlapping voices, all chanting my name. My skin crawled as I realized the sound wasn't just external. It was coming from inside me, vibrating in my teeth, my bones, my thoughts. The figure swung its legs over the edge of the bed and stood. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful, but wrong in a way I couldn't define, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. As it stepped closer, the ward shifted violently, beds sliding across the floor, walls stretching like melted wax. The entire space reacted to it, as if this version of me was the one holding the asylum together. Memories flooded back, unstoppable now. I saw myself as a child wandering endless corridors, my parents' faces blurring into faceless silhouettes. I saw doctors strapping me to a gurney beneath humming green lights, the same lights I'd glimpsed deep in the tunnels. I saw the West Wing burning, but from the inside, flames licking the ceiling while hands pulled me deeper into the smoke. These weren't random flashes. They were constructed memories, spliced into me like pages ripped from another person's diary. The other me reached out a hand, palm up. Its skin was my skin, but beneath it something writhed, pressing against the surface like it wanted to break free. Its smile widened, and in my voice it spoke a single word. Remember. The beds around us began to twitch. Sheets flew into the air, revealing dozens, no, hundreds, of figures identical to me. Their faces were blank at first, then slowly morphed into variations of my own expression. Anger, fear, sorrow, madness. It was a grotesque gallery of possibilities, a living testament to every version of myself the asylum had ever created. The whispering shifted, merging into a single coherent sentence that froze my blood. You are not the original. My vision swam as the ward twisted tighter, the ceiling collapsing inward while the floor stretched into a gaping chasm. The other me stepped closer, its hand now inches from my chest. I could feel the air vibrating, a pull like gravity itself trying to draw me into its grasp. With a surge of desperate instinct, I stumbled backward, colliding with a cracked mirror mounted to the wall. My reflection wavered and split, revealing not my face but 1,000 faces layered beneath it, stretching deep into infinity. I understood then. The asylum didn't merely house patients. It created them, assembling identities like experiments in a lab. I wasn't a caretaker wandering its halls. I was just another experiment, one that had lasted too long. The other me lunged, its fingers closing around my throat. As the darkness swallowed my vision, a final realization screamed through my mind. The ward wasn't twisting by accident. It was folding inward, like a fist closing around its prize, and that the other version of me had gripped it, phantom bruises aching as I stumbled through the collapsing ward. The walls folded inward like origami, corridors closing behind me until I finally burst into a long, sterile hallway, lit by a sickly yellow glow. I didn't care where I was anymore. I just needed answers. No more cryptic whispers, no more half-truths. Someone had to know what this place really was. And there was only one person left who might tell me, the director. His office loomed at the end of the hall, a single oak door that felt out of place in a building so ruined. My heart pounded as I shoved it open, and there he was, sitting perfectly still behind a massive desk, his hands folded neatly, as if he had been waiting for me all along. His silver hair gleamed in the dim light, his face unreadable. I demanded to know what was happening, my voice cracking under the weight of terror and fury. At first he said nothing, only watching me with those unnervingly calm eyes. Then, with a weary sigh, he motioned for me to sit. "You think Project Echo created this?" he said finally, his voice a low rasp. "But you're wrong. It only magnified what was already here." His words landed like a blow. He explained that the asylum had been built deliberately on a site known in ancient records as a thin veil, a place where the boundary between worlds was fragile, like skin stretched too tight over bone. Long before the first patient arrived, this ground had been a burial place for those who were not entirely human. Their spirits had never left, lingering in the dark places between realities. When the walls went up, he continued, they didn't just trap the patients inside. They trapped it inside too. His hands trembled as he spoke, the first crack in his controlled demeanor. It feeds on fear, on suffering. Every scream nourishes it. The experiments weren't about curing trauma. They were about silencing it before it broke free. My mind reeled. Project Echo hadn't been a failed medical experiment. It had been a desperate attempt to contain a predator older than the asylum itself. The director's voice dropped to a whisper. But the machine didn't quiet the voices. It amplified them, spread them through the walls like wildfire. The entity is growing stronger. Every hour, every death, it spreads. I asked him how to stop it, my words frantic. For the first time, his composure shattered completely. His face twisted with raw fear as he leaned across the desk. "There is a way," he said, "but it will cost." The light snapped off with a sharp pop, plunging the room into darkness. My breath caught as a sound rose from the blackness, a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. The director screamed once, a raw, human sound that cut off far too quickly. Then came the scraping of claws on wood, moving closer and closer until it was right beside me. I didn't breathe. I didn't dare breathe. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my skin like a living thing. My ears strained for any hint of where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to move everywhere at once. A wet dragging, followed by the sickening scrape of claws on wood. My trembling hand groped across the desk, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon, but all I touched was a slick, warm smear. My stomach turned as the truth hit me. It was blood. The director's blood. A faint whisper brushed against my ear, so close it felt like icy lips were grazing my skin. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Mockery. The creature wasn't just hunting me, it was playing with me. My pulse hammered like a war drum as I bolted from the office, my shoulder smashing into the door frame. Behind me, something moved fast, impossibly fast. The dragging sound replaced by a skittering that echoed through the halls like 1,000 insect legs. I sprinted blindly through the asylum, the hallways warping around me. Lights flickered on and off in rapid bursts, revealing glimpses of the nightmare at my heels. A formless silhouette, blacker than the dark itself, its limbs stretching too far, bending at angles no body should bend. Its outline was constantly shifting, as though reality itself couldn't fully contain it. And beneath it all, a chorus of screams, not from one mouth, but many, overlapping in perfect, terrible harmony. The director's words replayed in my mind as I ran. Thin veil, feeds on fear, growing stronger. This wasn't a monster that had wandered into the asylum by chance. The building was its nest, its hunting ground. Every terrified patient, every hopeless sob, every scream had been a banquet. Project Echo hadn't been about curing anyone. It had been about starving the thing long enough to keep it caged. But the experiments had failed. The machine hadn't silenced the screams. It had multiplied them, like feedback through a broken speaker. I stumbled into a stairwell, slamming the door behind me. For a brief, fragile moment, there was silence. Then came a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the metal like a drumbeat. The door began to bulge inward, denting with each hit. I scrambled upward, 2 steps at a time, knowing there was nowhere left to run. I needed the director's final words, the secret he hadn't finished revealing. Without it, there was no stopping this thing. At the top of the stairs, I burst into a wide corridor and froze. Written across the walls in smeared, rust-colored streaks were symbols identical to those carved deep beneath the asylum. They pulsed faintly, alive, like veins carrying poisoned blood. In the center of the corridor, something lay crumpled. It was the director's glasses, cracked and glinting in the sickly light. Behind me, the stairwell door tore free from its hinges. The creature's scream filled the space, louder than thunder, a sound that rattled my teeth and split the air itself. I clutched the symbols on the wall, praying they were protection. But a single horrifying thought surged through me as the darkness rushed forward. Maybe the director hadn't been trying to contain the creature at all. Maybe he had been feeding it. The creature's roar still rang in my skull as I stumbled blindly through the corridor, the symbols on the walls pulsing like veins lit by fire. The director was gone, swallowed by the thing he'd spent his life trying to control, and with his absence came a tidal wave of chaos. The asylum itself seemed to awaken. The walls shuddered, rippling like the muscles of some massive beast, while the floor pitched and heaved beneath my feet. Then came the screams. Not a single voice this time, but hundreds, layered atop one another, until the sound became a living entity. They didn't just echo through the hallways. They poured into me, rattling my bones, drilling into the softest parts of my mind. My vision swam as the air vibrated, every molecule charged with terror. Somewhere nearby, glass shattered. Farther away, a door slammed again and again, as if something were pounding to be let out. I wasn't the only one hearing it. From every hallway, staff and patients staggered into view, clutching their heads, their eyes wild with confusion. A nurse screamed and began clawing at her own face, her nails raking bloody lines down her cheeks. 2 orderlies turned on each other, grappling like animals, their teeth snapping. The screams were driving them mad, shredding the last fragile threads of sanity. I forced myself to focus. There had to be others still capable of reason, people who hadn't succumbed entirely. Through the chaos, I spotted a young nurse crouched beneath an overturned gurney, her chest heaving. Her name tag read Elise. I hauled her to her feet, shouting above the cacophony that we had to move now. At first she fought me, her eyes glassy with terror. But something in my voice must have cut through because she nodded, trembling. As we fled down a corridor, we nearly collided with a boy no older than 12. His hospital gown flapped around his thin frame and his head jerked in strange, twitching motions. Elise reached for him, but he recoiled, his gaze fixed not on us, but on the trembling walls around us. "I can hear it," he whispered, though his lips barely moved. The truth. It's calling. We didn't have time to question him. Behind us, the screams swelled, and the corridor bent in a way that made my stomach lurch. The floor rippled like liquid, tiles stretching and snapping back. A doorframe elongated into a grotesque arch, sprouting jagged edges like teeth. The asylum was no longer a building. It was becoming alive, reshaped by the very entity the director had warned me about. The boy's hand shot out, gripping mine with surprising strength. "This way!" he hissed. "The source is below." I didn't know why I trusted him, only that standing still meant death. Elise followed as he led us down a series of twisting stairwells that hadn't been there minutes before. The deeper we descended, the colder the air became until our breaths fogged in the darkness. Finally, we emerged into a cavernous space beneath the foundation. The stone here was ancient, etched with symbols that writhed under our flashlight beams. At the far end, a black fissure pulsed like a beating heart, and from it, the screams poured forth, louder now. layered and endless. Reality itself seemed to fray around the edges, the world warping like torn fabric. And as I stared into that abyss, I realized with bone-deep certainty that the asylum was no longer a prison for the creature. It was a doorway, sending a shockwave through the chamber that knocked us to our knees. Elise screamed as the stone beneath her split open like brittle glass, jagged cracks racing outward in all directions. The boy didn't even flinch. His pale eyes glimmered in the darkness, reflecting that sickly, otherworldly light. "It's almost free," he whispered, his voice carrying an eerie calm. The screams aren't just sound. They're hands, pulling at the veil. I grabbed his shoulders, shaking him hard. "How do we stop it?" My own voice was ragged, nearly drowned by the wall of sound pouring from the fissure. His gaze finally locked on mine, and for a fleeting moment, he looked heartbreakingly human. "You don't," he said softly. "You can't. You can only choose who it takes first." Behind us, a guttural wail erupted, not from the fissure, but from the tunnels we had come through. Shapes began to emerge from the shadows, their outlines flickering like half-formed memories. Some were human, or had been once, their faces stretched in endless, silent screams. Others were less definable, their limbs bending in directions that made my brain rebel. Elise stumbled backward, clutching my arm. "We have to run," she sobbed, but the boy didn't move. He tilted his head toward the fissure, almost reverently. "It's hungry," he said. "It needs fear to cross over. That's why it built this place. That's why it made you." His words cut through me like a blade. My memories flashed. The endless hallways, the phantom ward, the other versions of myself. A sick realization took root. I wasn't just a witness to this nightmare. I was part of its design. The walls around us began to pulse like living flesh, their texture rippling as if something massive was crawling beneath the surface. A low rhythmic pounding shook the air, in sync with my heartbeat. The figures closed in, their mouths opening wide. This time, they screamed not in unison, but in perfect mimicry of voices I knew. My mother, my childhood friends, even Elise's own sobbing cries. It was the sound of every memory weaponized against us. Elise broke first. She bolted toward the tunnel, shrieking, her flashlight beam whipping wildly. One of the figures lunged, swallowing her scream as its body enveloped hers. I reached for her, but the boy's hand clamped around my wrist with unnatural strength. "If you follow, it will only grow stronger," he hissed. His voice no longer trembled with fear. It carried authority, ancient and alien. "You knew this was coming," I whispered, horror dawning. He smiled. Not the smile of a child, but something far older wearing his skin like a mask. "I didn't just know," he said. "I called it." The fissure split wide with a sound like tearing flesh, and the chamber was bathed in blinding light. I felt myself being pulled toward it, my body stretched thin, my mind unraveling. The last thing I saw was the boy stepping calmly into the abyss, his voice echoing through the cacophony. "Welcome home." The fissure's blinding light faded, leaving behind a darkness so deep it felt physical, like ink filling my lungs. I stumbled forward, coughing, and realized I was standing in a space that didn't belong beneath the asylum, a cavern carved not by human hands, but by something ancient and hungry. The air reeked of rot and rusted metal, each breath clinging to my tongue like a bitter film. Elise was gone. The boy was gone. Only the echo of that terrible greeting, "Welcome home," lingered in my mind. I forced myself to move, my flashlight trembling as it pierced the gloom. The walls weren't stone anymore. They pulsed faintly, slick with a glistening sheen, like living flesh stretched taut over bones too massive to imagine. Veins as thick as my arm throbbed beneath the surface, pumping a dark fluid that smelled of iron and decay. A low guttural sound rumbled through the chamber. At first I thought it was the building settling, but then it came again, deeper, closer, resonating through the soles of my boots. My stomach twisted as I followed the noise to its source. In the center of the cavern loomed a nightmare made solid. A mass of twisted limbs jutted from the walls, each arm clawing blindly, fused into the structure like the asylum itself had been grown around it. Faces emerged from the surface, mouths frozen mid-scream, eyes rolling beneath translucent skin. Some were human, others were not. The mouths moved in unison, releasing a chorus of cries that layered together into one continuous, agonized wail. The realization struck me like ice water. This thing wasn't hiding inside the asylum. It was the asylum. Every shifting hallway, every pulsing wall, they weren't metaphors. The building was its body, and we were trapped inside its ribcage. A soft voice rose behind me, breaking through the cacophony. I turned to see the boy standing there, his hospital gown glowing faintly in the unnatural light. His eyes were blank now, pure white, his expression serene in a way that chilled me to the core. "It feeds on fear," he said, his tone eerily calm. "Every scream nourishes it. That's why it made this place a lure and a cage, both at once." He began to chant, words I didn't recognize spilling from his mouth in a rhythmic cadence. As he spoke, the strange symbols I'd seen in the tunnels ignited along the walls, glowing with a sickly green fire. The creature's scream rose to a fever pitch, its limbs thrashing, the ground buckling beneath our feet. I stumbled back, realizing what he was doing. "You're banishing it," I shouted, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to encourage him or stop him. The boy didn't answer. His voice grew louder, faster, the ritual building like a storm. The monster lashed out in fury, its tendrils tearing free from the walls and slamming into the floor. Stone cracked and collapsed, dust choking the air. I dove aside as a massive chunk of ceiling plummeted, narrowly missing me. When I looked up, I saw the boy still chanting at the center of the chaos, and the creature's countless mouths turning toward him in unison. The sight froze me in place. Hundreds of mouths, gaping wide, screaming in perfect harmony, not just a sound, but a weapon. The pitch was so sharp it rattled my teeth and blurred my vision. My knees buckled, and warm blood trickled from my ears. The boy stood unmoved, chanting louder, his small frame silhouetted by the glowing symbols that now blazed across the cavern like constellations. The ground heaved as the creature retaliated, its tendrils whipping wildly. One slammed into the wall near me, showering me with shards of rock and wet fragments of something that wasn't stone. I crawled forward, desperate to reach the boy, but the floor split open, a chasm yawning between us. Through the crack, I glimpsed a writhing interior, layers of tissue and muscle, pulsating as though the entire building had a heartbeat. The boy's chant grew frantic, the symbols flickering like dying stars. Elise's voice suddenly rang out in my memory, screaming, then silenced forever. A surge of grief and fury pushed me onward. I leapt across the chasm, landing hard on the other side, my hands scraping raw against the rough surface. "You have to stop," I shouted, but my voice was drowned beneath the endless, overlapping screams. The boy turned his head slightly, and for a heartbeat, his human face returned. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "It's the only way," he whispered, and then his features hardened again, overtaken by something ancient and unyielding. The creature reared back, its form swelling until it filled the chamber. Limbs tore free of the walls, dragging shattered beds, twisted metal, and fragments of the asylum's upper floors down into the abyss. It wasn't just attacking us. It was trying to collapse the entire foundation to bury itself and us with it. The boy screamed a final word, one that seemed to burn the air itself. The glowing symbols erupted into blinding light. For a split second, the monster froze. Its countless mouths opened wide, but no sound came out. Then its form began to unravel, peeling away like ash caught in a violent wind. The cavern walls convulsed, collapsing inward as if reality itself was being stitched closed. I reached for the boy, but a tendril whipped between us, striking the ground so hard it flung me backward. My head struck stone and the world tilted wildly. Through the haze, I saw the boy swallowed by the light, his small silhouette dissolving into nothing. His chant ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt alien. With the creature's body collapsing, the tunnels began to cave in. I stumbled to my feet, sprinting through the chaos as walls fell and ceilings disintegrated. The air filled with choking dust and the metallic tang of blood. Behind me, the final roar of the monster reverberated, so loud it felt like it came from inside my chest. I dove through a narrow passage just as the ground gave way, clawing my way upward until I burst into the cold night air outside the asylum. When I turned back, there was nothing but a smoking crater where the building had stood. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. Then from deep within the rubble, a single distant scream rose, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the monster's voice this time. It was the boy. The sky above me was gray, choked with smoke curling upward from what remained of the asylum. I lay sprawled on frozen earth, my body trembling, my mind clawing through fragments of memory. The last thing I remembered was running, the tunnels collapsing behind me, and a roar so loud it felt like the world itself was breaking apart. Now there was only silence. Thick, unnatural silence, like the air after a storm that hasn't truly ended. I pushed myself up on shaking arms. My clothes were shredded, my skin streaked with grime and blood that wasn't entirely mine. Around me, jagged remnants of the asylum jutted from the ground like the ribs of a massive beast. The building was gone, swallowed whole by the earth, leaving only a smoking crater. Somewhere beneath that ruin lay the creature, the boy, and every soul the asylum had devoured. I should have felt relief. Instead, a hollow ache bloomed in my chest. It didn't feel finished. The wail of sirens shattered the silence. Flashing red and blue lights pierced the fog as police cruisers and ambulances arrived, their tires crunching over debris. Officers spilled from their cars, their voices urgent and clipped. One knelt beside me, shining a flashlight into my eyes, asking questions I couldn't answer. The words felt foreign, meaningless. How could I explain what I'd seen when even I didn't believe it fully? They loaded me onto a stretcher, murmuring about trauma and shock. One officer muttered that the building had collapsed due to structural failure. Another speculated about a gas leak. Their explanations were flimsy bandages slapped over a gaping wound. I tried to speak, to warn them, but my throat was raw, my voice shredded to a rasp. When I finally forced out words, they dismissed them gently, like soothing a child after a nightmare. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, I caught a glimpse of the crater through the small back window. Smoke still rose from its depths, curling in strange, deliberate patterns, almost like symbols. A cold certainty gripped me. The thing wasn't gone. It was merely waiting. The paramedic beside me adjusted an IV, speaking softly, her tone calm and clinical. I barely heard her. My focus drifted to the steady beep of the heart monitor, its rhythm sharp and sterile compared to the chaotic screams that had haunted me for nights. The sound felt wrong, too clean, too normal. My mind kept expecting it to distort, to shift into that layered chorus of agony I thought I'd escaped. Then, faintly, I heard it. A single scream so distant it might have been the wind, or my imagination. It rose slowly, curling up from beneath the earth like smoke from an unseen fire. My breath caught. The scream built in volume, threading beneath the whine of the sirens, until it felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. I turned toward the ambulance window, desperate to see where it was coming from. But what stared back at me in the reflection was not my own face. It was Agnes, and she was smiling. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Agnes's pale, lined face stared back at me from the window's reflection, her lips curled into that same knowing smile she'd worn when she first whispered about the walls remembering. My breath fogged the glass, and for a desperate moment, I prayed it was just a hallucination. Some remnant of trauma clawing at my mind. But then her eyes shifted, subtle, deliberate, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that this wasn't my imagination. Agnes was there, watching. I jerked back, my pulse hammering, but when I turned to look directly, only my own battered reflection remained. The scream faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a hollow ringing in my ears. The paramedic glanced at me, concerned, but I shook my head, unable to form words. If I told them what I'd seen, they'd sedate me, maybe lock me away like one of the asylum's patients. And this time, there would be no escape. As the ambulance rattled along the cracked road, I stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragments of truth. Agnes had claimed to be there longer than the asylum itself, older than its history. Maybe she hadn't been a patient at all. Maybe she'd been something else entirely. Something that fed the asylum, guided it, ensured its growth like a gardener tending a poisonous vine. If that were true, then the destruction of the building hadn't been the end. It had been a molt, a shedding of skin. The vehicle jolted suddenly, throwing me against the stretcher straps. Through the back window, I caught a glimpse of the crater disappearing behind us, swallowed by the fog. For an instant, the earth around it seemed to pulse, as though breathing. I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. The paramedic reached out to steady me, murmuring reassurances, but her voice felt far away, distorted by the pounding of my heart. Memories of the final chamber flooded back, the writhing limbs, the countless mouths screaming in unison, The boy's face illuminated by the glowing symbols. He had sacrificed himself to banish the creature, but what if his chant hadn't destroyed it? What if it had only anchored it somewhere deeper, more insidious? The thought burrowed into my skull like a parasite, impossible to dislodge. The ambulance slowed as we neared the hospital. Outside, police lights painted the fog in streaks of red and blue. Officers clustered near the emergency bay, their voices raised, their faces pale. Something was wrong. Even through the closed doors I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the distant murmur of countless voices. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was below, rising through the ground. The hum built into a tremor, then a whisper, then a single, unified scream that rattled the windows. The paramedic froze, her eyes wide with primal terror. Slowly, I turned back to the window. Agnes's face was there again, clearer now, her smile stretching too wide, too sharp. Her lips moved soundlessly, but I understood the message perfectly. The walls remember. The final echo rose, deafening as the screen went black. Subscribe, if you dare.